Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
It embodies many of Wright's fundamental principles. And it's a different way of looking at architecture, I think.
The Teeter Studio near Bliss is the only Idaho building famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright designed. Tonight, we'll look at the fascinating story of its construction and now its renovation. Good evening. Perhaps more than any other American architect, Frank Lloyd Wright changed the way we think about buildings and the space that those buildings enclose. More than 25 years after his death, Wright's ideas about architecture are still widely studied and widely copied. Tonight we have a special documentary report that examines the story of the only building in Idaho that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. It's a special place because it is a Wright building, but also because it has a special history and very interesting owners. Producer Gary Richardson and director videographer Ricardo Ochoa have prepared the documentary, which they call Out of the Earth and Into the Light. Wright himself used those words to describe his goal of designing buildings that appear to grow from their sites and harmonize with their surroundings.
One of the natural things that a Frank Lloyd Wright fanatic does is to go and to look at any Wright houses or buildings that might be in the region. And so the first free weekend I had here, we came down from Ketchum and drove 90 miles down here to see this building, since it's the only Wright building in Idaho. And essentially we saw what you see here. There was a fence all the way around the building, and you could not see any more than this. And we didn't jump the fence and look in, but we just stood on the guardrail and looked over and took pictures. We'd come back over the next 4 years, maybe once or twice a year, and just look at this exact same view and start wondering what was on the other side of the fence. I think architectural historians have not, and probably for a while will not, look upon it as a real important building because of its location, because of the modest nature of the construction of it. But it's a very important one, I think, nevertheless, because it embodies many of Wright's fundamental principles that he identified early on in the 20th century.
Yes, Mr. Wright used this in his Falling Waters house back in Pennsylvania. In fact, he suggested, or the specifications called for similar type of rock on the Teeter house. And so when I saw that in the specifications, I looked around here and found where it came out natural. And I wrote him a letter and told him I had what I thought he would be very pleased with.
The only Idaho building Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed sits on a bluff about midway between Hagerman and Bliss, overlooking the Snake River. It was built in the mid-1950s for the artists Archie and Patricia Teeter. Archie Teeter, a Boise native, was the first of the Jackson Hole landscape painters. He would spend his summers painting and selling his work beside his car. His paintings, often of the Tetons, appeared in national magazines and in galleries from New York to Portland. In 1952, the Teeters asked Wright to design a small cantilevered space facing the river, where they could spend 7 or 8 months a year while Archie painted. Wright, whose own Taliesin West near Phoenix, Arizona, combined studio and residence, could understand the Teeters' desire for a place where they could both live and work. Frank Lloyd Wright is probably best known for his large projects, such as Tokyo's Imperial Hotel and the Johnson Wax Research Center in Racine, Wisconsin, both built in the 1930s. Or New York's Guggenheim Museum, built in the 1950s. But Wright was first and foremost a designer of homes. The Kaufman residence in Pennsylvania, better known as Falling Waters, is one of the most famous houses in the world. Wright designed it in 1936. Wright himself never actually came to Idaho to see the Teeter studio, either during the construction, which lasted some 4 years, or by the time it was completed in 1957, about a year and a half before Wright died. Mrs. Teeter's efforts to get Wright to come here were considerable and may have contributed to some of the difficulties and delays in the construction itself.
Well, I had been working through a fellow named Fred Reed, a contractor from Twin Falls, and he was telling, he called me one day and said, "I just got a plan here I'd like you to look at." And I went down and he said, when I saw it was a Frank Lloyd Wright house, well, I became very enthusiastic because at the time he was my ideal. I thought there was no one quite like him. He was right at his prime. Well, he was past his prime, but
in 1954, Kent Hale was a young stonemason. He had learned about Wright's work while studying landscape architecture at Utah State University.
With him. And so I, no way I was going to miss this job, and so I did everything I could to get it. I just met Mrs. Teeter first. I just went down to see him when I heard about this, and I said I thought I had the type of rock that they wanted and would be happy with, and so I went to Hagerman and asked someone, I says, where can I find Mrs. Teeter? He said, in the post office. He says, they started going to the post office, and I says, how'll I know her? And he says, don't worry, you'll know her. She was quite different, in other words, and so sure enough, I saw the ladies there and I knew which one was not a native of our area.
Kent Hale was born and raised in Oakley, Idaho, a 19th century Mormon settlement known itself for some fine examples of period architecture. In the early 1950s, Hale was the first to quarry the hills above Oakley. Since then, the town has become famous for its stone.
Well, this is one of the most natural stones there is. Up until this time, most of the stones that have been used have been a sandstone. And the sandstone, the masons found they could work it so easily, face it and so forth, that that's what they used. But this is very unique in that the stone comes out in a natural manner, which it doesn't need a lot of workability. For instance, you can take a little piece like this, and it's already cut. Nature made this for us. We didn't have to work it so much. Not only that, but when you laid it in the wall, well, you got the natural effect. You didn't have the old tailor-made stuff that masons been using for years and years. And this kind of started more of the rustic natural effect that stone should be, rather than the tailored effect which most people have been using. There are about 10 different kinds of rock here. What we used came off of the surface. It had been weathered and had lichens on it. And it was warm. Mr. Teeter did like warm colors. And he also liked smooth rock. His feeling was that when you touch it, it feels good. I want the rock to feel good, and not just look good, but I want this feeling. Some of the rednecks kind of shied away and says, I'm not sure I want to work with him.
The Teeters started, they were thinking it'd be done within a year at the most.
Bob Waite is a historian and a friend of the current owner of the Teeter Studio. He is writing a book on the building and its original owners.
Tricia had difficulties, I think, dealing with people who worked for them, dealing with the contractors. Had this idea that contractors, lumberyard owners would want to come forward, provide materials, provide the time and labor for nothing, to be part of this project that was bringing civilization into Idaho.
I think they were very, very publicity conscious, and they wanted Frank Lloyd Wright to come out here. They wanted to meet Frank Lloyd Wright at the airport, and they wanted the news media there. And so I think they were constantly stirring up trouble and writing letters, and so he would come out here. But he never did. I think he understood what they were doing, and so he never showed up.
She gradually, over the course of a couple of years, identified what she felt to be a contractor's conspiracy. And she openly referred to that in letters to friends, in letters to congressmen, in letters to J. Edgar Hoover, saying that there was a contractor's jungle involved here in Idaho, that part of it was that they were Mormons, she felt. Part of it was that they were simply conspiring against the Frank Lloyd Wright building. It was way beyond their capacity for understanding it. She blamed the Mason, said he was a Mormon, that was part of the trouble.
As they constantly found fault with what I was doing, most obvious thing was when the specification called for 4-inch space for insulation. Well, I used this 2x4. 2x4 is only 3 and 5/8, and when they got the ruler out and said, this isn't quite 4 inches, I said, well, I know, but this is standard procedure. Everyone does it this way. He said, no, Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't do it this way. I said, well, I'm quite sure he does. They sent weekly news bulletins in, and one time they sent in a little article that said they were a little bit delayed on construction of the building because they had to teach a stonemason how to lay stone. This was the last straw as far as I was concerned, so in order to
Placing a lien on the studio for back wages, Hale found other work.
I think all in all, though, that Patricia was very tight financially, was continuously afraid that the money wouldn't hold out, that they'd be taken advantage of, and she wanted to get it done for nothing.
It took close to 24 masons and would-be masons, including Archie Teeter himself, to complete the stonework over the next year.
There was a lot of different personalities entered in, different feelings, different artistic values, and so there was a very great difference between what the specifications called for and what I was doing compared to what finally ended up in this building. For instance, the specifications called for ledge-type stones, which was used similar to what was used in the Falling Waters house in Pennsylvania, which was something like this area here. Everything is straight, a few little ledges sticking out. The reason it's called ledge-type stone is because it's parallel and fairly artistically laid. But there doesn't seem to be any form that was followed. It was laid more haphazard, and as far as I can tell, it was no relation to the specifications. When they continued, and it was, for instance, up in there, you can see that the stone is put in there to fill in. In other words, there was no thought to aesthetics, there was no thought to design, there was nothing at all, no way compared to the way the specifications requested. Consequently, I felt quite unhappy the way that turned out, that particular aspect of the house.
What would you call that up there?
Haphazard. Amateuristic haphazard, I guess, would be kind of a pretty good name for it.
Wright's original sketch shows the Teeter studio from the west, the only side from which the entire building can be seen, the view from across the Snake River. From this vantage point, the stonework seems to grow from the bluff naturally, yet the diagonal thrust of the roof line asserts a conscious intent and propels the structure, to use Wright's own words, out of the earth and into the light.
I like the way his idea of having a building relate directly to the site and to grow out of the site, as opposed to maybe being a white box sitting on top of a site, the way some other people look at architecture. His idea is to mold the house into the site and have it organically grow out of the site. I think that Wright looked at it as though the only way that man can abstract nature, or perhaps the best way that man can abstract nature, is to do it geometrically and to use shapes such as the hexagon that occur in nature. and circles.
Henry Whiting, a landscape
and,
architect from
squares and
Ketchum, bought the
rectangles.
Teeter Studio in 1981 for almost $250,000.
When Wright started designing a building, he started with a grid, and he would lay out a grid on a blank sheet of paper. And this grid consists of a number of repeating diamonds. And each diamond is actually 2 equilateral triangles put together so that the angles are either 120-degree angles or 60-degree angles. And after he lays out this grid, he then starts to put the walls of the building all parallel with grid lines. And so what you have is a very different kind of effect in that there are no traditional right angles in the house. They're all 120-degree angles or 60-degree angles. And he starts with that basic idea and then builds out from there. And it's a different way of looking at architecture, I think.
The Teeter Studio is a superb example of Frank Lloyd Wright's organic style. For Wright, everything in nature was architecture. He designed his buildings according to an organic ideal uniting plan, structure, materials, and site. He called it continuity.
He tries to end the division between interior and exterior spaces as much as possible. That prow has a way of extending the space past the actual walls of the interior. The space is more infinite, I'd say. And in that it extends past the windows, one doesn't really know exactly how far it extends, and it makes it seem that much bigger. Well, one of Wright's ideas is that it's never easy to find the front door. He likes to manipulate people through his houses and make them move around. He doesn't make it obvious where the front door is, as on a typical American house. So you have to walk all the way around the building and actually experience the river before you get to the front door. The house essentially turns its back on the street. This window that you can see right here is basically the only window that faces towards the street. It opens out towards the river, the other direction, and I kind of view it as though if you look at the street as being civilization, it turns its back on civilization and opens out onto nature and onto the riverside. This is the wall that faces the street along here, and as you can see, there's only one window facing towards the street, with the rest being blank wall. This window behind me is the only window facing the street, and Mrs. Teeter added to Frank Lloyd Wright's concept of turning the back on the street by placing a one-way mirrored glass window on the lower window here, behind which was her desk where she would sit, and when someone would ring the doorbell or the doorbell at the gate, she could sit behind the mirrored glass window and decide if she was going to answer the gate or not and open it and let the people in.
Henry Whiting became acquainted with Wright's work while growing up in Midland, Michigan, the home of Dow Chemical Company.
And my great-uncle, Alden Dow, was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's back in the 30s. He was one of the original Taliesin Fellows, and Alden designed most of the buildings in our town, most of the major buildings, as well as, I believe, 60 residences, including our own. So I grew up in a house designed by a Wright student, so the Wrightian space has always been quite natural to me. And perhaps my favorite building of Alden's was this building, which is his studio in Midland, and this is where he practiced. I used to, when I was in college, I used to go and over to see Alden, and we would sit in the studio and talk about different things, including Frank Lloyd Wright. And I remember in particular one time Alden was very interested in modular design in the same way that Wright was. And Alden had designed these modular blocks to, they were actually sort of a game that he liked to play, a design composition game. And one afternoon I remember spending the whole afternoon sitting there with him playing with blocks.
When Whiting bought the Teeter Studio, it had been vacant for several years, Archie Teeter had died in 1979, Patricia the following year. The studio had been neglected.
My first feeling was, boy, this thing is in bad shape. Some of the nice features of it had sagged, it was overgrown, there was stains and a lot of water damage on it. You could feel that it had a lot of promise, but it needed a tremendous amount of work.
Well, I kind of viewed it as though one was taking a beautiful piece of antique furniture out of the attic, and it needed to be dusted off. And what we did was basically that. It took about 2 years to do it, however, and it involved refinishing all of the exterior wood, which had quite badly deteriorated, replacing all of the windows, and fixing the kitchen and the bathroom.
Here's a fellow who had spent literally years and years studying the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, had a great feeling for it, and knew that he wanted to restore it and stay true to the ideals of Frank Lloyd Wright.
When I first bought the Teeter house, the kitchen and the bathroom were both very small in size, and what we did was to move the kitchen back into this space, which was a workroom. And in doing this, we started by considering finding the middle of the room, the middle point in the room, and essentially making a post right there. And the skylight is centered on this post idea, and then we have walls radiating on the grid lines from this post, and then it forms the kitchen in here and then the bathroom on the other side of the wall. And everything revolves around this post idea.
Henry Whiting's wife, Lynette Kessler, is a choreographer. She exercises in the studio every morning for several hours.
In my work as a studio space, the place is exhilarating. I've lived in studio spaces for 12 years in institutional spaces like galleries, art galleries, performance spaces in large theaters, or studio spaces in institutions. And they're usually concrete, dark, no windows, but the idea of all the windows in the space and the energy going up and out is totally exhilarating. I remember the first time I walked in, and the first thing I remember was the smell from the big fireplace and the wood, and of decades of fires in this house. And it's a real kind of woodsy, musty, it smells like a place of age, which is really good to be up here on this canyon wall. Sometimes the wind is really strong, so it's very nice to feel soothed inside the house.
Not only has Whiting added his own Wrightian touches while restoring the original studio, he has also made the place into something of a Frank Lloyd Wright museum.
This house doesn't actually have a dining room as a more traditional American house would, and most Wright houses in the later part of his career did not have a formal dining room. Since the dining area is in such a large space, it would be awkward, but for these chairs which have very high backs, and so when you sit around the table, the backs of the chair is actually behind your head, and it encloses the space, so you have an enclosed dining room space actually in this large studio space. The dining room chairs that are in this house are the last incarnation of his design for a dining room chair. He designed dining room furniture from perhaps 1890s all the way through, I believe these were designed in 1957, and he died in 1959. So these are the last version of this design. The bar stools in the kitchen were designed as a way of uniting the new kitchen design with the existing Frank Lloyd Wright design, and they're based on the Frank Lloyd Wright dining room chairs. They're very, very similar in design to those. We started with a house that had a few pieces, for instance, the dining room table and the dining room chairs, and then there were some small there were these ottomans over here were in the house, and some tables were in the house as well. The lamp behind me here is an interesting story. That is something that we built, and that was something. That is a lamp that the Taliesin people dug out of the archives. It's a design of Wright's from the 1950s that had never been constructed before. So these are the first examples of this Wright design ever to be constructed. The chairs that we're sitting in are also designed by Wright. The drawings were in the house when I got the house, but they had never been constructed, and so these were also constructed by us. I've been collecting Wright books and etc. for about 10 years now, and I have quite a large collection of Wright books, as well as the stained glass window. It's from one of the houses in Chicago, and I'd have to look up which one it is. It's not one of the famous houses, but it's from the south side of Chicago, and apparently the people decided that they looked a little showy for the neighborhood, and they took all of them out and stored them in the basement and put regular casement windows in. There were like 60 of those in the house. And the bronze pieces in the kitchen, and place settings from the Imperial Hotel that he designed. So there's china as well. He was quite a versatile designer.
You often hear discussion when talking about Wright buildings about whether they work. This was designed as a studio, a place to both live in and work in. Does it work?
It's a very basic kind of a space, almost a shell of a building, but it's a creative, exciting space where we find that both of us are more creative when we are here, living in this building and working in this building. I think that one of that Wright meant for the people who lived in his house to live up to his house, that it's not a static thing just there. It's a very dynamic thing, and you have to live up to the house. And for me, it's been very, very exciting to live here, to do just exactly that. It's a very exhilarating place to live in. It's a very creative kind of a space inside, and it's always exciting to be here. And for me, yes, it works tremendously.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back here tomorrow. And from all of us at Idaho Public Television, Happy Christmas. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.